Hi, this is a short introduction to Michel Serres' Natural Contract. It's an essay or chapter in his book, The Natural Contract. Serres is a French phenomenologist working in the latter half of the 20th century, early 21st century. So in phenomenology, he's interested in how mind-body together moves through the world and thinks through engagement with the world. This is evident in this essay, Natural Contract, which is about how humans, both bodily and socially, engage with the world around them. And it's broken into a series of sections, and let's just have a look at those. Keep in mind, he's looking at how humans are in dialogue with their surroundings. He starts with this interesting observation. In French, the word temps means both time and weather. He says, really, if we think about this, what is the major shift that has happened over the last 100 years? And we can list out a whole bunch of possible shifts. I think perhaps the largest is, he says, there was a time of sailors and peasants. And sailors and peasants were engaged with the nature around them. Whereas now we live in labs, in offices, in studios. If you want to look at the weather, time, weather, if you want to look at the weather now, you don't go outside, or you're not outside in it. You just pull up your phone, look at an app and say, oh, the weather is this or that today, and how's it going to be tomorrow? Whereas for the sailor and the peasant, they're exposed to that weather. So there's a clear and direct dialogue, bodily dialogue, and it affects their very life and livelihood. For the peasant who might be working in the fields, for the sailor on the high seas. So this shift between being engaged with and vulnerable to the weather and to the land and landscape. What we have now, we make our own weather through air conditioning, and we make our own time. Think about the power of electricity, right? So things can happen 24 hours. There's stuff that's open always, 24 hours a day. So we make our own time. We're not as sensitive to when is sun up and when is sun down. Again, weather, time, temps. So this gets us out of joint with the rhythms of nature. We've insulated ourselves or isolated ourselves from them. Nature has a series of long-term rhythms. The problem with a lot of contemporary society, Sarah says, is it works on short-term rhythms. So for politicians, they're being elected every 4 years. The question of climate change, which is a generational problem over decades, it's hard to get elected on it because you have to make tough decisions that might not see a benefit by the next 4-year election cycle. And in terms of economics, the stock markets work on yearly basis. In fact, they work on quarterly basis. So every 3 months, producing results. And so in those kinds of economics, it's hard to gamble on something that's very long term because the investment and payoff is too far out. So nature is long term, humans are working at a different time scale, at a shorter term. So this is this conflict in the dialogue. In the next section, he's really interested in the problem of mastery, problem of property. So around the 1600s, we see this rise both of science, but also a rise of property rights and capitalism. So owning things. The environment, he says, the environment around us then is, if we think about environs, means to form a ring around. So we as humans are at the center, and we own the environment is all that's around us. So we're at the center of things. What he is interested in, Michel is interested in, is putting us, what happens if we're at the periphery and the rest of the world, the rest of the earth is at the center? So what if we could shift things? Instead, he says the problem is that nature has been reduced to a nature for humans. And it's been reduced to humans in history and humans accessing nature through reason. Whereas nature will go on without history or without reason. This is very much like Chakrabarty's four thesis, which is his The Climate of History four thesis. So it makes a very similar argument here. And then in the second kind of half of the essay, Michel Serres begins to look at what would happen if we moved from being parasitic on the earth, that is, we feed off, we're extractive, right? We have oil, coal, all these extractive economies. We extract from the air, polluting the air. We extract from the oceans, the decline in fish species, or dirty the oceans, the amount of pollution that is involved. So we're parasitic to the earth. What if we move from this one-way street of use to a two-way exchange? Again, he's interested in dialogue between humans and human bodies and the surroundings. So what would a two-way exchange look like with the earth? And he asks several interesting questions. One, what if objects themselves are legal subjects? That is, what if we made parts of the earth, and if we made animals, incorporate them within our legal framework in the sense that they had voice and agency, not that they were possessions and things to be used. And so he begins to ask, what would it be like? What language does nature speak in? What language do rocks speak in? What languages do animals speak in? And how do we listen to them? Then, toward the very end of the essay, after asking how objects speak, he begins to look at a politics, and he opens this section with the question of the cybernaut. And cybernetics, he mentions, has to do with steerage. Why is he interested in steering? Remember the sailor at the very beginning of the essay. So at the beginning of the essay, the sailor is one who's sensitive to his environment or her environment. So the metaphor of the ship is one of a sailor who is sensitive. And there is a seagoing pact, right? We have to abide by what's happening in the oceans, and we have to get along with each other on the ship as well. So that creates a different kind of community. One that has to think its own fragility. Now, in a university setting, in an intellectual setting, often we think of mastery. How can we conquer? How can we conquer these ideas? How can we explicate in a way that is clear and shows mastery? Instead, he is asking, how can we think fragility? That is, how can we imagine ourselves, understand ourselves as porous to those around us and as porous to the natural environment? And in being porous, then we are able to respond because more closely attuned. And he ends, Michel Serres sometimes shows a bit of his Catholic history here. He ends with this question of religion. He says the word religion comes from to bind. So if we are thinking our fragility and we're attuned to the community around us and the environment, then how do we bind ourselves to that? And we bind ourselves through a love, through a care, through a vigilance that is outside of political time or economic time. It has a longer durational and intergenerational stance that is in a slow time that abides with the time of nature. So again, think of, if you keep in mind it for a natural contract, how are we in dialogue with nature? Now, the human contract, what we call the social contract, which was established in the Enlightenment period, is the idea that we're all in society together. And so we have to implicitly, we don't, at birth sign a contract, we agree to be a part of a society, but we implicitly follow rules to society because we want to be a part of it, we want to benefit from it, and of course, in benefiting from it, we also have to give to it by responding to and listening to its rules. So if that's true for the social contract, Michel says, what would a natural contract be like? What is that relationship like? And so hopefully this gives you a small primer to the essay.